The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Welcome to 2020, a year of hope for the right, dread for the left, and endless political talk for everyone else. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, as always a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. As we enter a new decade on another leap year, we'll lay down markers for the year ahead this week. LibertyNation.com political columnist Joe Schaeffer will discuss his recent column on moments from 2019 that Democratic presidential candidates will regret in 2020. Stephen Moore, one of the architects of President Trump's successful economic policies, will tell us what to expect for the economy. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza discusses threats and promising developments for individual liberty in 2020.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick off the year's proceedings in this, our 9th year on the air, with our signature segment, Say What?, where we roll out an assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. A few things likely slipped your notice over the holidays, and today we will bring you right up to speed. Of course, the biggest item on the agenda, impeachment, is still awaiting the delivery of the articles of impeachment from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. It will happen at some point this coming week, one suspects. And then a Senate trial will ensue and Trump will be acquitted. What's not yet clear beyond that delivery date is who's going to win the battle on how the trial is conducted between Trump, who wants a long, drawn-out trial with tons of witnesses, and McConnell, who wants to get it over with as soon as possible. Now, one of the witnesses Trump would really like to have placed under the Klieg lights is Joe Biden. And true to form, when the former vice president was questioned about whether he'd comply with a subpoena to testify, likely, about his dealing in Ukraine, which resulted in his son Hunter getting paid millions of dollars with no qualifications and getting the prosecutor investigating his son's company fired, Biden said he'd defy a subpoena and then doubled down when asked about it by editors of the Des Moines Register, most prominent newspaper in Iowa, home of the first Democratic presidential contest.
Do you stand by your earlier statements that you wouldn't comply if you were subpoenaed to testify in an impeachment trial before the Senate?
Correct. And the reason I wouldn't is because it's all designed to deal with Trump doing what he's done his whole life, trying to take the focus off him.
Doesn't that position you as if you're defying a subpoena, putting yourself above the law?
Well, look, the grounds for them to call me would be overwhelmingly specious.
So Biden was clear. He will not honor a subpoena. Well, he was clear at least until the next day, that is, when he suddenly did what he's so often done during the campaign, reversed field.
Would you comply with the subpoena?
Yeah, would you show?
I would honor whatever the Congress, in fact, legitimately asked me to do.
So we are led to believe that Joe Biden will show up under subpoena only if he decides it's legitimate. One way or another, Trump's beatdown on Biden for the Ukraine mess has only just begun. Biden still somehow leading the Democrats' presidential race, but the other two frontrunners, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, are full-on socialists who support the Green New Deal and Medicare for all, among other economy-destroying proposals. And Bernie's most high-profile supporter is none other than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who said at a Bernie rally over the holidays that America under Trump is akin to Nazi Germany. And then just listen to her agenda.
It is fascism. What we have, what we're evolving into as well. What this campaign is about is a radical realignment of our priorities in the United States of America. It's a movement of anti-racist Black liberation activists, of immigration activists, of queer liberation activists.
You thought Barack Obama's fundamental transformation of America was frightening? That now sounds tame. But socialists like AOC get big play in the virtue-signaling Trump-deranged echo chamber media, while Trump voters get consistently condemned by the likes of Chuck Todd, host of NBC's Meet the Press. Listen to what Mr. Todd said during a special Meet the Press on fake news and alternative facts with the editors of the two most prominent Trump-deranged publications in the country, New York Times and Washington Post.
I want to read you guys a letter to the editor that we found in the Lexington Herald-Leader. It was a fascinating attempt at trying to explain why some people support President Trump. Here's what he says. Why do good people support Trump? It's because people have been trained from childhood to believe in fairy tales. This set their minds up to accept things that make them feel good. The more fairy tales and lies he tells, the better they feel. Show me a person who believes in Noah's Ark, and I will show you a Trump voter. Look, this gets at something, Dean, that my executive producer likes to say is, hey, voters want to be lied to sometimes. They don't always love being told hard truths.
Not only does that perfectly depict the spectacular disconnect between the inside the Beltway media, which speaks only to itself, each other, and fellow leftists, and regular workaday Americans, but just how cowardly is it to hide your own beliefs like Chuck Todd did behind a letter from some unknown person? Corrupt and cowardly. That is the elite media circa 2020. Another thing that happened over the holidays was an editorial from the head of the magazine Christianity Today, Mark Galley, supporting the impeachment of Trump. He did that on his way out the door. He's now retired. And he did it despite the overwhelming support Trump has enjoyed among evangelical Christians. But you will just love this response from the Reverend Al Sharpton.
The reason they're so offended is it's exposing all of them that they would take this shameless con man over the principles that they're preaching in the holy season. As we celebrate Jesus, they would sell Jesus out if they felt they could get something from it.
Al Sharpton calling anyone, a shameless con man is akin to Jussie Smollett attacking someone for making stuff up, or Hillary Clinton condemning someone for being unlikable, or AOC calling someone an extremist. But as we look to the presidential election now just 10 months away, one of the keenest observers of politics has been, and continues to be, the famous left-wing filmmaker and Bernie Sanders supporter Michael Moore, who called Trump's win in 2016 and now says Trump is only looking stronger 4 years later.
If the vote were today, I believe he would win the electoral states that he would need, because living out there, I will tell you, his level of support has not gone down 1 inch. In fact, I'd say it's even more rabid.
Now, Moore went on to bring forward a fact little known about how the Michigan voters in 2016 were actually more anti-Hillary than they were pro-Trump.
There were 90,000 people in Michigan, almost 90,000, who went to the polls, mostly Democrats, and very large numbers of them in Detroit, Flint, Pontiac, Saginaw. These are all black cities, majority black. They stood in line in the cold for 2 to 3 hours to vote. They went in there and they voted for state rep, state senate, county commission. They voted for the Democrats all down ballot and left the top box blank. 90,000. She only lost Michigan by 10, 11,000 votes. 90,000 wanted to send a message to the Democratic Party. You forgot us a long time ago out here, and we will not put up with this anymore.
And so Trump won narrow upset victories in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, on top of big wins in Ohio, Missouri, Iowa, and Kentucky, completing a sweep of the heartland everywhere but Illinois, plus a narrow loss in Minnesota. Democrats cannot win the White House in 2020 without flipping one or more of those states. But instead of trying to win back those voters and promise to do better by them this time, they've demonized the Trump voters. And those thousands of Democrats who Michael Moore described who refused to vote for Hillary in 2016 have seen nothing from the Democrats to change their minds this time. Quick break, and then we're back with 5 defining moments from 2019 which will haunt the Democrats in 2020.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Where can you find honest political commentary with sobering analysis, accountability, deconstructing threats to our liberty, and boldly reporting the truth? Subscribe to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel, where facts matter.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
2019 Democratic presidential wannabe moments that point to 2020 disaster. That's the headline of an article by our political columnist Joe Schaeffer, heading into this new year on LibertyNation.com. And Joe joins us to explain and provide the details. Welcome again, Joe.
Thanks for having me, Tim. Happy New Year.
You as well. So let's go through what you consider defining moments of a process that so far has produced much in the way of extreme proposals like the Green New Deal, but little in the way of a candidate who's actually emerged as an unquestioned leader in the field with the first contest in Iowa just a month away. Number one on your list, raise your hands.
Yeah, I mean, this was right out of the gate, the first debate in Miami. It was the second night. You had some of the big names who are still in the race, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Pete Buttigieg. And Savannah Guthrie of NBC News asked all 10 people on the stage, like school children, raise your hands if you're for giving illegal immigrants health care coverage with U.S. taxpayer money. All 10 of them raised their hands like lemmings. That was a sign right there that the progressive agenda is driving the bus here. It's not the individual candidates. This is going to be a radical primary race, and we've seen that pretty much nonstop since.
Well, I got the moment in my mind as the one where Democrats may have lost the election right there simply by supporting taxpayer-funded health care for illegal immigrants unanimously. So it can be shown no matter who the candidate is, that will be a visual that the Trump campaign will use. But number two on your list may have been even more damaging. We are going to take your guns.
Yeah, that's Beto O'Rourke. He came like a comet and fell just as fast. But unfortunately for Democrats, he left his mark, and that was it. That was in the September debate. He thought that was a good way to just resuscitate. It was already a flagging campaign. But, if the NRA could come up with a poster child for the grasping, gun-grabbing Democrat, you couldn't come up with a better ad campaign than what Beto O'Rourke offered with that statement. Yes, hell yes, we are going to take your guns. That's what he told the American people on national TV.
And again, Joe, this is something that's going to be used by the Trump campaign, even though Beto O'Rourke has long since plummeted headfirst off the cliff as a candidate. But let's move to number 3 on your list of defining moments of the last year that could spell disaster for this year, 2020. Number 3 is transgender kid asks question on national TV.
Yeah, I thought that was a big one, just again underlying who is calling the shots in this Democratic field, and it is not the candidates. If you are Elizabeth Warren's campaign manager, and they have a lot of agency in these, this was a CNN nationally televised town hall, they have a lot of say in what gets asked and what doesn't. They don't want their candidates embarrassed. You do not allow that question to be asked of your candidate if you're trying to win a general election in 2020. So having a 9-year-old transgender child being used as a political prop like that, and Elizabeth Warren looking just awkward and with her manic energy, just going along with that. It was the most cringe-inducing television for someone in heartland America to watch.
The number 4 one on your list is not something that's had a lot of attention paid to it. It's unhinged moderators.
Yeah, this is the DNC basically sabotaging their own pool of candidates because, they have the call on this. Why would you want Jorge Ramos, a Hispanic open borders radical, basically browbeating the candidates on their loyalty to illegal immigration and massive open borders, which is what he did for a whole debate. And then you had earlier Don Lemon, CNN, asking his predictable, racially obsessed questions, which did nothing to further the debate, nothing to reach out to Americans on the issues they care about. And, of course, Rachel Maddow asking one of the candidates whether or not Trump could be criminally prosecuted after they remove him from office. And Trump is just sitting back and absolutely loving it.
Okay, Joe, so the last item on your list, number 5 of defining moments of 2019, which will haunt the Democrats in 2020, is Hillary's eternal shadow.
Yep, it's still there. It's always been there. It's not going anywhere. She's let us know that. Every time she's made a statement such as, I have no plans to run, or I'm only concerned with beating Trump in 2020, she's sending out that message, I'm still here. I'm going to be here next summer. It makes the candidates look small, which I don't think matters to her one bit, we know. It shows, again, they don't have the stature to move the party beyond these old ghosts of the Clintons. If you're President Trump in the White House, you're saying, please, Hillary, keep talking, please getting involved, keep getting involved, keep hovering over this field of candidates. And that's what she's been doing.
You would think a party with any kind of disciplined leadership would simply instruct Hillary to please leave the stage and stay off it. But instead, she keeps coming back like a bad reminder, like a bad nightmare for Democrats of 2016. So, Joe, we'll be talking a whole lot this year. We're starting today, beginning of a new year. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tim.
Joe Schaeffer, LibertyNation.com. From politics, we move to the economy in the year ahead with a key architect of the Trump economic policies, our old friend Stephen Moore.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
So we said in one of our last shows of 2019 that the real story of the year was the same as the previous 2 years, the economy and jobs. More than 7 million new jobs have come online since Trump took office. 7 million. One of the key architects of the Trump economic policies, the great economist Stephen Moore, an old friend of the show, joined us to forecast what's ahead for 2020. And we started by discussing the remarkable fact, perhaps the only one you need to know, that there are now more than 1 million more jobs than there are people to fill them.
So there are about 7.2 million job openings today. And according to the latest jobs report, there are about a little less than 6 million people who are unemployed. So, that means that even if you put every unemployed American looking for a job into a job, you'd still have 1 million to 1.5 million jobs left over. That's a nice problem for a country to have.
Isn't
and I don't think we've ever had that problem before, where we have too many jobs and not enough workers. Most countries in the world, I think, virtually every other country in the world have a shortage of jobs. We have a surplus of jobs.
Now, Steve, Trump is a man famously given to impulsiveness when it comes to his words, but he seems very patient with his long-term goals in foreign policy and trade, most specifically with taking on China with that trade war that seems to have thrown something of a monkey wrench into the works. But now we have the first phase of the China trade deal, which you discussed, in place. What specifically is in this deal, and how likely is it to reverse the downside of tariffs and help the U.S. economy longer term?
Don't forget, Tim, we do more trading with Canada and Mexico than we do with China, and that's oftentimes overlooked. So that's a really important deal to make North America a tariff-free zone. And then, 2 days later, he announces he's got his deal with China. Is it a great deal? No, it's not a great deal. But is it a good deal? Yeah, it's a pretty good deal. It's better than I thought we would get. It's just phase one, and there will be multiple phases of this. But, it basically is going to almost double Chinese imports of American products. So that's a very good thing for the United States. And I do think it was one of the few dark clouds over the economy was whether we could settle this trade dispute and lower tariffs rather than raise them. And that's what this deal essentially does.
Now, the Democrats did, as you say, approve the successor agreement to NAFTA, the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement, hours after they completed articles of impeachment, apparently a sudden impulse to actually legislate instead of just investigate and impeach. But how much of an improvement is this as an upgrade over NAFTA?
Well, I think it's certainly a modernization of the Canada-Mexico trade agreement, and I think it's in some ways an improvement. Some of my colleagues at the Heritage Foundation are not happy with some of the provisions, but hey, look, the big picture here is what we have to look at, Tim. What this preserves is the Ronald Reagan vision of making all of North America, Canada, the United States, and Mexico a free trade zone so that we could compete against Europe and Asia. And that's what this trade deal effectively does. And so I'm proud of it. I think the president can take a lot of credit for this. And look, it's going to pass bipartisan vote, to pass this. So I think it's a huge achievement for the country, and I think Trump deserves a lot of credit.
Our guest is Stephen Moore, key architect of the Trump economic policy as outlined in his book, Trumponomics. Let's talk a little bit about free trade more broadly speaking. Economists and particularly politicians love to talk about free trade as if that's what we have now, which it really isn't. How free, though, is our trade really, and how do you react to Trump being labeled as a protectionist or a trade warrior?
Milton Friedman believed in unilateral free trade. We should have no tariffs, and open up our borders regardless of what other countries do. And I used to believe that to be true, but I think Trump has changed my mind a little bit about this. What Trump is showing is that you can strategically, because we're the United States, we're the alpha male economy in the world, we're the one country that everyone has to trade with, we can use that leverage. And by the way, that's a word that Trump understands from being in business. When you have leverage, you use it.
Yes.
We use our leverage against these countries like China and the Europeans and Canada and Mexico to, basically threaten them with tariffs unless they give us a fairer deal. Because when Donald Trump entered office, he was right. It was not a level playing field. We were playing free trade, and the rest of the countries were imposing high tariffs on us. And the end of the day, if this works, Tim, and so far it works pretty well, we will actually have less restraints on our ability to trade abroad and to sell American products. And so, you may end up with freer trade, but a more level playing field. And I think that's a win-win for everybody.
Well, while the U.S. economy has been very robust over these last 3 years, we've seen slowing economic growth through much of the world in recent months. To what extent does this global slowdown damage the American economy and threaten to turn down the heat on this economy?
Tim, it's a problem. It's a problem. Japan, Japan, Europe, Germany, a lot of these countries are just not growing. And they have too much socialism. I wish people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders would take a look at what's happening with these socialist economies. It's not a pretty picture. So, yeah, this hurts our economy because, exporting is part of our economy. And when other countries are not growing, they don't buy as much of our stuff. And that has had a little bit of a negative effect on our economy and our growth rate. But you know what? Ultimately, I hope what these other countries do is exactly what other countries did back, in the Reagan years. They looked at what's happening in the United States and saying, hey, I want what they're having. And they start adopting our policies. Trump proves it's not complicated. You cut your taxes. You cut your regulations. You provide people with abundant and cheap energy. And you put your country first. You put America first in our case. And boy, did it produce results.
Yes, you simply let people keep more of their money and get out of the way. Now, it looks like after the results of the election in the UK, which produced an overwhelming mandate for conservatives and a repudiation for this increasingly hard-left Labour Party, that really is a reflection of the socialism that you said really exists throughout the European Union, that Britain will finally now close the deal on Brexit. How are you figuring this will affect the economy of the European Union, the U.S., and globally?
Oh, it's just such a positive development, Tim. And, the ultimate winner here are the British people and the British workers. Because, for the last 30, 40, 50 years, Britain has been kind of in this tug of war, whether they move towards the, European socialist model, or do they want to be more like the American, free market capitalist, model. And I think what's happened by shrugging off these entanglements with, continental Europe, they are more likely to move towards the American free market model, which we know is the model that works. And by the way, I would love to see, Tim, we were just talking about trade. How great would it be if Donald Trump could sit down with the Brits and have a free trade deal with Europe? I mean, with Great Britain. I think that would be fantastic for both countries.
Yep.
I find it so interesting that the Europeans don't want to let Britain out. It's like,
no, they don't.
The Hotel California, you can check in, but you can't check out. And I think the British people were just so frustrated with the Euro bureaucrats in Brussels who were, they were trying to, it wasn't even about economics. It was about, people in Brussels telling people in Britain what kind of tea kettle they could use and how much energy they could use and what kind of light bulb they could put in their, bathroom lamp. I mean,
right.
This is a victory for sovereignty.
Precisely. That's exactly what it is. So the Brits can be British again instead of European, which they never considered themselves to be to begin with. So that's a basic problem. But, Stephen, let me close with something of a thought experiment, if you will, as we turn from looking backwards to the 3 years of Trump to forward to a potential second term. Now, what can Trump realistically get done in a second term if the GOP also controls the House and Senate, if they only control the Senate, or if he's forced to work with an entirely Democratic Congress?
Well, just broadly speaking, I think in a second term, Trump gets even tougher with China. China is a huge, huge problem for the United States, both militarily and due to their predatory economic practices. And I think the American people are totally behind Trump and getting very tough. We're in a new Cold War with him, don't you think, with China?
Seems to me, I mean, we're in a cold war between the left and right in our own country.
Yeah, no, that's true. So I think we're going to see some additional toughness with China. I think you're going to see an immigration bill where we complete building the wall, but we also then expand our legal immigration, so legal immigration, so that people can come in to the country lawfully and contribute to our economy and get, as Larry Kudlow would say, the brainiacs into this country and the people who work hard and are so integral to America's success. And then I think you'll also see tax cuts 2.0 with a new middle-class tax cut. But by the way, that's a sharp contrast to where the Democrats want to go, which is raise every tax they can get their hands on. So I expect a very successful second term for Trump.
Stephen Moore, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you, Tim.
And a Happy New Year.
Thank you.
From the economy with Stephen Moore, we move to individual liberty with Scott Cosenza when we return.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now, for the first time in a new year and a new decade, we welcome in our legal affairs editor at LibertyNation.com, constitutional lawyer Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Decade.
Happy New Decade to everyone listening as well.
So we want to focus on threats and promising developments to liberty that you might expect in the year ahead. Last time we talked about the threats from the past year. And one of the things you pointed out was the threat, as a threat to liberty, or a defeat for liberty on our year-end show, was the beatdown of the gig worker and the gig worker economy. And sure enough, here we are. Our first story in 2020 is about a judge halting California gig worker law from taking effect for truckers.
Tim, unbeknownst to you, in all the stories I selected for this week for your purview, there's some sunshine for liberty. I thought for our first show of the new year, let's turn our cheeks to the sunshine and try to have a good thought.
Okay,
so,
it is California after all.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
And this is courtesy of U.S. District Judge Robert Benitez of San Diego, who has issued an injunction against the enforcement of the ban against the gig worker economy. California passed a law that said basically you can either have employees or a very limited kind of sector of independent contractors, but we're using large groups for independent contracting work was banned. The truckers actually have a much easier road to seeing this kind of an injunction, and it's because of their interstate commerce activity. It's almost impossible to argue that their activity is not interstate commerce and then governed by federal law exclusively. And that's why they, I think, Tim, were the first of the many gig-type workers to get an injunction against enforcement of the ban on their working.
Isn't this really all about the perceived inability to collect sufficient level of taxes? If there's too many 1099s, independent contractors, they can't keep them under government control the same way they can if they're W-2s.
I think it's probably genuinely both that and also the perception that people who don't have W-2 employment don't have unemployment insurance protection. They don't have health care benefits like more or less likely to have those benefits. So I think it's probably both. The cynic in me, Tim, would say that you're right. But like I said, we're going to look and celebrate their good motivations for wanting people to be covered. But what it doesn't do is account for the reality that even many of those people don't want a full-time. Many of those Uber drivers, for instance, perhaps not with
they don't want
the
a
truckers,
full-time job.
Many do not.
No.
They're students. They're doing other things. And, they should have the freedom, Tim, to make their own way the best they can with whoever will pay them what they accept as a valuable wage.
Okay, Scott, let's move on to our state of residence. Not a home state for us originally, but we've both made our livings and homes in Virginia, in the Old Dominion. And a Virginia bill here would end single-family only zoning in the Old Dominion. And if you start thinking about the number of things that would change if zoning laws don't protect single-family neighborhoods, it's quite extensive.
Oh, yes. I think that's one way to say it. Another way to say it is if zoning laws stop enforcing the will of the people who have the capacity to pass zoning laws on property owners.
Let me expand this for a moment. What is a libertarian view on zoning? In other words, pure libertarianism, as I understand it, states that it's perfectly okay to not have zoning laws which would, it's an extreme example, but allow a factory to go right next to a single-family home.
Yes, with the exception of in a libertarian sort of ideal, there would be covenants that could be enforced. So you could have a large housing development, for instance, where you agree not to do certain things, like build a factory on your house. Or if I was making the rules, operate a leaf blower early in the morning.
Or paint your door the wrong color. Yeah. We've also talked a lot in 2019 and 18 and even back into 17 about the spectacular deregulation of the Trump administration. Donald Trump promised to rid the nation of 2 regulations for every new one that was instituted, and it's turned out closer to 10 eliminated for every new one. And he issued, it turns out, Scott, the fewest regulations in 44 years and a third record low.
The Federal Register published 72,564 pages for the year, 24% below the record set by Obama of 95,894 in 2016. And here's the kicker. Some of those pages, Tim, involve the removal of the previous regulations. So when it's all said and done, it'll actually even be lower. Fewer regulations still than what's reported. I think it's one of the underreported stories of the Trump presidency, and every single one of those was a regulation that was not voted on by a legislator or legislature. It is regulation by fiat, and there are rules that Americans have to obey, or they have to pay money, sometimes a lot of money. Some business doesn't follow some rule that's published in the Register, they get fined massively. So I think it's a real boon to liberty that these regulations are being eliminated.
It's interesting that when I've seen CEOs interviewed about the booming economy we've been going through the last 3 years, they will often cite deregulation as a bigger factor even than the tax cut, which produced better results than even the architects of the tax plan had hoped. Now, I'm confused about the next story, Scott, because as we all know, it's been well established that President Donald Trump is a misogynist and he hates women, and yet he has signed a bill to eliminate a backlog of rape kit testing. Reconcile those two.
Well, I can't count. Yeah, perhaps one of them is not true. You know, I'm reminded, Tim, of a story that I heard about from somebody who visited the FBI's Quantico training facility, and this is in the wake of the Silence of the Lamb movie. And for people who remember that, there was this famous FBI profiler, and they said they had these teams of people there studying and learning, and they said, oh, are these like profilers to learn how to stop crime? And the person who was responding said, no, these are drug warrior. This is just drug warrior classes. So for people who don't know, the federal government spends money massively to fund our drug war, not just through federal authorities, but through state and local authorities, through this massive block grants and educational things that they do. We can turn all that attention on all sorts of crimes that we want to prioritize the prevention of. And I think it's just great news that Donald Trump is choosing to turn some of the federal resources against what I would hope we would prioritize against the drug war, which is rapes in America. And these are about these forensic test kits that exist in police departments throughout the United States, but they either lack the resources, whether it's financial or administrative, to get it done. And they haven't prioritized that kind of enforcement. So that Trump I think, is great news.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue. If you like your podcast civilized, that's the one for you. They are all available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week and hopefully throughout the decade of the Roaring 20s. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty, and we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.